Hi everyone, this is the Edexcel International A Level biology paper. This is May-June 2024 and Unit 2 as you can see here. This covers cells development, biodiversity, and conservation, and the total mark for this paper is 80 marks. Alright, let's get started. Question 1. A plant contains several types of cells, tissues, and organs. State what is meant by the term organ. So for this, I wrote an organ is a group of tissues that work together to perform a specific function. So that's the 1 mark. Right. Part B, the photograph shows part of a cell. Which organelle is labeled X? So this whole thing that we see here is the nucleus. And the X that you see here, you can see there are lots of dots. That means that there are ribosomes on it, so it must be the endoplasmic reticulum, specifically the rough endoplasmic reticulum because of the little small dots, which are the ribosomes. All right, part 2. The organelle surrounded by the membrane labeled Y contains the nucleolus. Give the name and function of the organelle that contains the nucleolus. Okay, like I mentioned earlier, it is the nucleus and it's responsible for storing genetic material. Now this is only 1 mark, so this is all you'd have to write for this question. All right, part 3. Which of the following are functions of the nucleolus? So the nucleolus is responsible for producing ribosomes and for synthesizing RNA. So specifically, the nucleolus is responsible for producing rRNA. The R in RNA stands for ribosomal. And if you recall, ribosomes are made up of protein and rRNA. All right, let's move on to part 4. Organisms can be classified into 3 domains. State which one of the 3 domains would contain an organism with the organelles X and Y. So X was the rough ER and then Y is the nucleus. The only domain that has that are the eukaryotes. Eukaryotes. Okay, let's move on to part C. The drawing shows tubers of a potato plant developing below the surface of the soil. Organic molecules are transported through the potato plant into the developing tubers. These molecules can be used to form starch molecules, which structure in the cells of these tubers which store starch molecules. So out of these 4 options, 2 of them store starch, but chloroplasts are found in cells that undergo photosynthesis, like in the leaf, for example. But here we're talking about cells of tubers, and tubers are found below the soil or in the soil. And therefore, the structure that stores starch would be amyloplast. So amyloplast is an organelle that stores starch, and it's typically found in storage tissues like tubers. You can also tell from the name as well. It starts with AMY, just like amylopectin or amylose, or amylase, which is the name of the enzyme that breaks down starch. Okay. Lastly, explain how the structure of starch enables the protein tubers to have a high energy content. All right, so this is what I wrote. Starch is a polymer of glucose. So that's the first mark. And then lastly, it is compact, therefore a lot of glucomolecules can be stored. Okay, let's move on to question 2. Interphase and mitosis are parts of the cell cycle. Part A, the photograph shows a plant cell in interphase. Part 1, interphase is part of the cell cycle when mitosis is not taking place. Which of the following processes occur during mitosis? So interphase takes place before mitosis. An interphase consists of 3 stages, G1, S, and G2. DNA replication takes place in the S phase, so S stands for synthesis. So therefore, statement 2 is correct. Whereas both G1 and G2 is responsible for the cell growth and also for organelles duplicating and synthesizing. So the G stands for growth. So things like protein synthesis would occur, organelles would be replicated, and cell growth. So all 3 of them would occur. Okay, the photograph shows some stages in the cell cycle. Which row shows the correct sequence of these stages? So the first stage would be where V is, so that would actually be interphase. We know it's interphase because the chromosomes haven't started to condense yet. And then later in Z, that's when it starts to condense, and that would be prophase. So here, the sister chromatids would join together and you would have this X-shaped looking chromosome. After that, the chromosomes line up in the middle, so this would be metaphase. You can kind of see the chromosomes lining up in the middle there. Once they line up in the middle, the spindle fibers shorten and the chromatids get separated, and they would move to opposite poles, and that would be anaphase. After anaphase, you would have telophase. So telophase would be where you can see cytokinesis is happening, in which the cell is dividing into two. And the reason why they put the scale bar there is to show you that the cell, these two daughter cells, are actually smaller than the original cell. So therefore the order is V, then Z, then X, then Y, then W. So therefore the answer is C. Okay, let's move on to part 3. Calculate the magnification of photograph W. Use the scale bar to help you. So we've got the scale bar that's on top over here. So for this question, you'd have to use your ruler, and you would use your ruler to measure out the scale bar. So from here to here. And let's say when you measure it with a ruler, it's about 1.8 centimeters, or that's 18 millimeters. Now the equation for magnification is magnification equals image size over actual size. Now the image size is 18 millimeters. The actual size is 24 micrometers. Now the problem with this is that the units are different, so we'd have to make sure the units are the same. What we can do is times 18 by 1,000. Let me just write this up here. So we get 18,000 micrometers, because if you recall, 1 millimeter equals 1,000 micrometers. And then divide that by 24. And the answer is 750. Okay. The mitotic index of a tissue is calculated. The tissue had 450 cells in mitosis, and the mitotic index was 37.5. Calculate the number of cells in the tissue that were in interphase. Okay, so the mitotic index is the number of cells in mitosis divided by the total number of cells, then we would times that by 100 to get a percentage. So let's plug in the values. 37.5 is the mitotic index. We have 450 cells undergoing mitosis. We don't know what the total cells are, and that's what we're trying to find out. And times by 100. And then once we do this, we get 450. Oops, that's supposed to be 100. We get 1,200 cells, and interphase means that if they're undergoing interphase, that means that they're not undergoing mitosis. So that means we would do 1,200 minus 450, and that equals 750. Okay. Part C. Describe the events that occur during prophase of mitosis. So in order to move around the chromosomes, it's important that they start to condense first, to form these X-shaped chromosomes. So that's what I wrote here. Chromosomes start to condense. You can also see the nuclear membrane is starting to break down, and that's what I wrote here as well. And lastly, you can see the green stuff over here, the centrioles start to produce spindle fibers and move to opposite ends of the cell. Okay, part D. Some new cells produced by mitosis are used for repairing damaged tissues. Some new cells produced in mitosis are used for growth of tissues. Explain an example of a tissue that could be produced in a plant. So you can talk about any tissue. You can bring up xylem, phloem, spongy mesophyll, palisade mesophyll. I'm just going to write xylem. All right, part 2. Give one role other than growth or repair for new cells produced in mitosis. So this one would be asexual reproduction. Another thing you can also say is cloning. All right, question 3. The photograph shows a Gentoo penguin from Antarctica. These penguins swim in very cold Antarctic waters in search of food. They feed on fish, squid, and shrimp. Explain 2 anatomical adaptations of these penguins that enable them to survive in this condition. Use information in the question to support your answer. So let's scroll up first so we can see the penguin. I'm just going to zoom out so you can see the question. So there are several things that you can say about the adaptation. First of all, they live in very cold conditions, right? So they have a lot of fat or a lot of blubber, and that helps to keep them warm. Now, they need to be able to swim in search of food, and you can see their body is very streamlined, right? And that helps them to propel themselves through the water quickly and reduce water resistance as they're moving through the water. To add to that, you can say that it's got webbed feet and these wings that help them to swim. So that would be in the same mark. So they feed on fish, squid, and shrimp, and you can see that their beaks are very pointy, and that enables them to catch the food. You can even talk about the color of their feathers. So you can see they mostly have black feathers. And if you've covered a little bit of physics, you know that darker colors are very good at absorbing light and therefore absorbing heat, and that would help them keep themselves warm. Okay, so I'm going to scroll to this part and answer this question. Okay, this is what I wrote. They've got blubber, and that acts as insulation to keep them warm. So this would be considered 1 mark. And streamlined bodies and webbed feet, you can mention one or the other, and that helps them to swim. All right, that would be the 2nd mark. Okay, the map shows 4 groups of islands that have Gentoo penguin populations. It has been proposed that the Gentoo penguins on these 4 groups of islands are different species. Suggest one way in which these penguins can be shown to belong to different species. So there are different ways you can answer this question. The first thing that came to my mind was looking at the differences in DNA. So if the differences in DNA are large, then you could consider them as different species. Another way you can approach this question is also talking about whether or not they can interbreed to produce a fertile offspring. Now, if they are different species, then it means that they cannot breed or interbreed to produce a fertile offspring. All right, so you can answer any of those 2. Okay, so this is what I wrote. If the penguins from different islands come together, they are unable to breed to produce a fertile offspring. Okay, part 2. Explain how different species of Gentoo penguins could have formed. Use the map to support your answer. Let's scroll up to the map. So you can see there is a geographical barrier between these penguins because they live on different islands. And because they live on different islands, there is no gene flow between these 4 populations. And therefore, within their islands, they experience different environment or different selection pressures So perhaps like one island, has different food that's available, or another island has different predators that are there. And so in these individual islands, they would undergo what we call differential selection, meaning that they all undergo different selection pressures. And then those that are more likely to survive would pass on their allele to their offspring. And so different populations would pass on different alleles to their offspring. And so what happens is that they accumulate so many changes that they are unable to interbreed with each other. Okay, so the first point I mentioned is that the islands are far away from each other, and the sea acts as a geographical barrier. Because of this, there is no gene flow between the populations. So all of this would be considered 1 mark. Now, whenever we talk about natural selection, we have to mention that there is variation in the population, meaning that you have, in this case, for example, let's say you have penguins of different sizes, penguins of different fur color perhaps, or different patterns on their fur, or different body masses. So there needs to be variation, because if everyone was exactly the same, then they would all have the same survival rate. So we need to mention that there is variation between the population, and each population experiences different selection pressures. And you can also give an example there. So that's 3 marks so far. And then those that survive better are more likely to produce and pass on their advantageous allele to their offspring. So then that would be the 4th mark. And the 5th mark would be they accumulate so many changes because they would pass on different alleles. Then they're so different that they are no longer able to interbreed to produce a fertile offspring. That would be the last mark. So this would be 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 marks. Okay. All living organisms are made of cells. Some cells are specialized for their function. One specialized cell is a sperm cell. Draw a mammalian sperm cell showing the acrosome, the nucleus, and the mitochondria. All right, so I've drawn out the diagram of the sperm. We've got the acrosome over here that's responsible for containing hydrolytic enzymes to break down the zona pellucida. We've got the nucleus here that contains the haploid nucleus, and both of these things are found in the head of the sperm. Lastly, you've got mitochondria, which is found in the mid piece of the sperm, and mitochondria provides energy for the sperm to swim. All right, the next part B, a human egg cell is another example of a specialized cell. A human egg cell has a radius of 50 micrometers. Calculate the volume of this human egg cell. Use a formula. Okay, so we've got 4/3 times pi times 50 to the power of 3. So in the calculator, this is what comes out. But we're just going to add or use 3 sig figs. So that's 5 to 4 micrometers cube. 5 to 4. Okay. The surface area of this egg cell is 31,416 micrometers square. Give the surface area to volume ratio. So the surface area is 31416 and the volume is 524,000. Now if you look at the answer, you can see that we want the volume to equal to 1. And in order for that to happen, we need to divide both sides by 524,000. So 524,000, this would equal to 1, and this would equal to 0.06. I'm going to write 0.06 over here. Okay, I've already written down the answer for this question, but part 3, it says, explain 3 ways in which the mammalian egg cell is specialized for its function. So first, I wrote that the egg cell has a haploid nucleus, and again, because a sperm has a haploid nucleus, so when 2 haploid nuclei come together and fertilize, you'd form the correct diploid number. So that would be the second mark to ensure that the zygote has the correct number of chromosomes. Another thing you can also say is the egg cell has zona pellucida, which prevents polyspermy. Polyspermy is basically when you have more than one sperm going into the egg, which we don't have for humans. because the zona pellucida prevents that from happening. And lastly, the egg cell is rich in lipids to provide energy for mitosis, because once you form the zygote, they would undergo multiple rounds of cell division. Okay, part C, a fertilized egg cell, I've included this image here, but a fertilized egg cell develops into a morula and then a blastocyst. Which of the following are correct statements? Okay, so just to do a little bit of recap, once the sperm and the egg fertilize, it undergoes mitosis. So it goes from 1 cell, 2 cells, 4 cells, and it keeps on multiplying until you form a ball of cells called the morula. You can see that here as well. And then afterwards, it would rearrange themselves like this, and this is called the blastocyst. So we've got some cells over here, and we have this fluid-filled cavity called the blastocyst cavity. So let's go through the statements one by one. Statement number 1, a blastocyst contains pluripotent cells. That is correct. And if you recall, you've got totipotent and pluripotent. So pluripotent means that it can differentiate to all types of cells except for extraembryonic cell, which means that it can't form cells like the placental cells. Statement number 2, a blastocyst is a hollow ball of cells where a morula is not, and that is correct. You can see there's this hollow cavity that's here, whereas a morula, you don't really have that. So statement 2 is also correct. Both of these structures contain cells which divide by meiosis. Ooh, it should be mitosis for this. Because with mitosis, you're forming genetically identical cells. So this would be A. Okay, that is it for part 1 of the June 2024 paper. If you want to go through questions 5, 6, 7, and 8, you can check out part 2. Thank you for watching, and if you have any questions, please leave them in the comment section below. And subscribe for more videos. All right, happy studying!